Good to be back with you tonight, and I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here today. This evening, we're going to spend some time looking at some things that we find in the Old Testament, and just to kind of set up what we're looking at tonight, I was asked to teach the adult class at Jacksonville. I guess it was this past Wednesday. So a lot of the things we're going to look at tonight, try to turn it into more of a sermon format rather than class. But I had been previously, I guess it was earlier last week, there was a documentary that I had watched several years ago, not too many. Going back, I think it came out in 2017. But the name of the documentary is Genesis History. And it's not anything that was put together by the church, but it's a very good documentary. They did a really good job of really answering the question and taking that question of the book of Genesis and looking at it and trying to look at things throughout this earth and from the standpoint of geology and other of the different types of sciences that we see. And they really do a good job. I would encourage anyone that has not had the chance to see that to try to watch that at some point, because again, they take a lot of things that modern science, and I put that in quotes, would look down their nose at, and a lot of things they would look at, and they do a good job of explaining how that fits really what we see in the book of Genesis and the story of creation, how the earth was created, not just that, but the things we see, the remnants of the flood, the worldwide flood that we know the Bible tells us has occurred, and they approach it from a science standpoint, and they do a really good job of seeing it through the lens of science. And I wrote down a few little quotes, a few things as I was watching that to kind of, it sort of jumped out at me because, again, it had been several years since I had seen it. But one of the things that they do as they begin the documentary, they set up how they're approaching the look that they're taking, and they do a good job of explaining what a paradigm is. That term paradigm, it's probably, if you're like me, you've heard it before, but you really hadn't ever looked it up to know what that word means. But really the idea of what a paradigm is just the framework and how you interpret information. In other words, how you look at something and really the focus and the lens that you're coming from and what you're seeing and how you would look at that and interpret that. And they do a great job of setting that up, saying there's two different approaches really to the world we live in. And if we think about it and we look at it through the lens of the Bible, we see the Bible is really it's a witness of our history. It tells us the origin of things. We can go back and we can look at the book of Genesis, and it gives us a detailed history of what God did in creating this earth. And there's really, this is one thing that they pointed out that I thought was interesting because it makes sense. There are really two views of our history in respect to looking at the earth and its creation. One is given to us through God's Word. The other is created by us, and by us we mean mankind. Either we accept what God told us happened, and we can look at the proof that is pointed out, and they again do a great job in that throughout that documentary of pointing to things that prove and show how that what we see around us fits the idea and the model of creation, as well as the fact that we had a flood. And that's the biggest thing that they focus on, because so many look at the book of Genesis. They want to look at the Bible and accept it to a certain extent. But when you get to the book of Genesis, a lot of people have a difficult time in really believing all that we find throughout. The idea of creation, how it was created in just a week, the flood, all the things that take place. And they want to dismiss parts of the Bible and accept others. But we have to understand if the Bible is true, then we have to see the entire Bible as being truth, and we can see that. And again, they do a great job setting up our study tonight. We're not going to worry a whole lot about the idea of creation and all, but from the standpoint of science, and we think about what the Bible teaches in regards to science, there are really two categories of science that we see in the Bible. The first that we see is, Bible and science truly agree. They're in agreement. There are things that modern science or laws that have been proven throughout time, and principles that science really is based upon, that we find being pointed out in God's Word. And then there are other things that we'll see that we could, put in the category of being scientific foreknowledge. Things that the writers writing so many years ago, there's no way that they would have had an understanding of the principles that what they were writing applied to science the way it does. And we'll notice a few of those tonight as well. But we're going to begin, if you have your Bibles, I mentioned the book of Genesis, and that's really where we're going to start. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. And we probably can all quote this verse. It's one of the earliest ones I remember learning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As we think about this one verse, science, it really has 5 principles that it sets itself upon. And we see all the way back from Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, these 5 principles being pointed out in God's Word. The first thing we see is in the beginning, that idea of time. Science, you take into consideration how time makes something happen or react. We see that here in verse 1. In the beginning, we have time. Then we have God. We have a force. Science looks at force. Think of physics, one of my least favorite of the sciences. Never did too well in physics, but we see how there's a force. And we have that force behind the creation, and that's the next thing we see. In the beginning, God created. We see an action, something that was done to the things around it, and God is the force behind that. And then we see the last two, the heaven, that will be space, and the earth, that's matter. As we think about those principles, again, in the, I believe it was the 18th century, many that did not believe in the Bible, these are some things that they pointed out as being, again, principles that science, any type of the science that's studied, is based upon. And we find that again in the very first verse that we have recorded for us. Not just that, there's some laws of science from different disciplines, there we go, science, that we find in the book of Genesis as well. And the first that we're going to notice would probably fall under biology, and that would be the law of biogenesis. The idea that something comes from its own kind, right? And we see that set up in the very first, very few verses here of Genesis chapter 1. If we were to drop down to verse 11 and 12, on day 3, when God created the sea, the land, the vegetation, we're going to think about the vegetation here. God said, verse 11, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. It was so. Verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Also, jump ahead to verse 24. Day 6, right? We know God created animal and man on day 6. Again, the same idea is put forth in verse 24. God said, let the earth bring forth living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beasts of the earth after his kind, and it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth on the earth after his kind. So again, we see the idea of what has been given the title of the law of biogenesis. That basically means that life has to come from other life, right? It can't be created, and no matter how convincing some of the things out there may be, scientists have never been successful at creating life out of something that did not have life. They'll tell you that there's been experiments done in labs where they've been able to create something that almost, but it just doesn't quite have that life. And it's something that we see. The Bible points out things that are alive come from other things. And again, that's something that was proven. I think it was Louis Pasteur. I think he was the one involved that eventually, through some experiments, accidental experiments to begin with, and he determined that life comes after its own kind. And we see that being the case, what the Bible teaches us. Also, a principle we notice in Galatians chapter 6, we think about that. You're going to reap what you sow. That's the idea. You plant a certain type of seed, you're not going to get something different. So we see that being a principle that's put into place. I've got to go quick. I realize I've got a lot more than I know I'm going to have time to get to, so we're not going to take too much time on some of these. But there are two other laws that I want to point out, just because scientific laws are things that have been proven. They've been determined. We know that they're fact rather than theory. Theory is something that someone has came up with an idea. We think this is the case. We're going to do experiments. Once those experiments confirm what they think, it becomes a law. That's why we call it the theory of evolution. It hasn't been proven. It's not true, and that's why it's only a theory. Sadly, we see man and modern science trying to push that on us today, but that is not the case. But let's notice two other laws quickly, and then we'll notice some of the foreknowledge that we see throughout the Old Testament as well. The first thing we're going to notice, the first law, or second law, we've already noticed one, but this would be more in the physics realm, but what we call the first law of thermodynamics. Basically, another term for it would be the conservation of energy. The idea there is in a system that matter and energy, they can change forms, but they can't be created or destroyed. So in other words, when something is put into play and it begins to go through all the interactions, it doesn't lose, it can lose energy, but it's not destroyed and it's not created. And we see the principle there being set forth in Genesis chapter 2. If we were to look at verses 1 and 2, we see as this chapter begins on day 7 of creation. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he made. So what we see here is when God had finished on day 6, he was through with his creation. It fits that law of thermodynamics. When he was finished, nothing more was being created, nothing more is being destroyed, because we see it. They just change forms between energy and matter, and that's one thing that we'll notice in the next law of thermodynamics, which is called the second law. And basically this states that in a closed system again, in those systems that have been given all they're going to get, if you will, that these systems tend to go from order to disorder. Makes sense, right? You buy a new car, how long does it take before it begins to give you problems? It begins to wear out, it begins to run down, and that's the idea of the second law of thermodynamics. And we see that as well being a principle that we can find in the Word of God. In Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, here we see, "And thou, Lord, in the beginning hast laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of thine hands. They shall perish, but thou remainest, and they shall all wax old as doth a garment." Again, God created things, and what do we see this earth doing over time? It's growing older. It begins to get older, and the writer of Hebrews here is pointing out that there's going to be a time that they perish. There will be no more. They go from a state of order to disorder, and we can understand that. Our room, we clean the kitchen, and it doesn't usually stay clean, does it? It goes from a nice system of order to disorder very quickly around our place, because it doesn't take very long. to get to that point. But we understand that. And we see the Bible is pointing that out as well, as we notice there in Hebrews chapter 1. Shifting gears just a little bit, now more from that idea of scientific foreknowledge, things that these writers, as we go back, especially in the Old Testament, and we notice some things from the Old Testament, that these writers really would not have known without having that information given to them. And we understand the Bible is written through the inspiration of God. Those men were given the things to pen and to write, and again, they may not necessarily had to have understood everything they were writing. And we know the Bible is not, we don't use it as a science book. It's not for that, but it's interesting to me to see that these writers, so many hundreds and thousands of years ago, when they penned these things, many years later, science finally shows up and says, hey, this is the way it is. And we see that through that scientific foreknowledge, those men had recorded these things. And some of the things we'll notice, some of the things are around the idea of really health and medicine. If you look at the book of Leviticus, and we'll notice some of that in just a little bit, time and time again, things that are said, laws that were given to the children of Israel were given. They didn't understand why. They were just given them. But today we can look back and see that there really is a good reason why God gave them these laws, and specifically in Leviticus 11 and 13, and we'll notice those a little closer in just a few minutes. But to begin with, the first thing to notice tonight, and we're going to stick kind of more in Leviticus for a little while, but in Leviticus chapter 17, verses 11 and 14, here we find that blood is necessary for life. It's blood that gives us that of life. If we were to read the verses here, Leviticus 17, verse 11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. Here, what's being pointed out that we want to focus in to begin with is life of the flesh is where? It's in the blood. We realize that a body that doesn't have blood is not a live body, is it? We have to have that blood in order to live. We understand how we breathe in, our lungs transfer oxygen, blood carries it throughout our body. It allows us to live. It also returns that carbon dioxide from our body to our lungs. When we breathe out, we exhale that. It's a system that's very amazing, but we see all the way back in Leviticus 17, verse 11, that life is found in the blood. Verse 14, for it is the life of all flesh. The blood of it is the life thereof. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, ye shall eat the blood of no manner of flesh, for the life of all flesh is the blood thereof. Whosoever eateth it shall be cut off. So again, a few more things given to them, but he gives a reason why they were not to eat the blood of those animals. Well, because life is in the blood. What's interesting is back in the 1800s, even in our country, we think back and we can think of during the times of George Washington, what was one of the practices of medicine, one of the things that they would do in order to try to heal someone would be to what? To cut a vein and to allow that blood to come out, because the idea was, well, something's wrong in the blood. It has to be removed in order to heal them so they can continue to live. But what do we know now? Well, we know that that's typically not the case, and there are other things we could look at from the idea of germs and viruses that we know about today that really cause those sicknesses, but they didn't have that understanding. And another thing to keep in mind is, where was he raised? He was raised in Egypt, right? And at that time, they were cutting edge, if you will, of a lot of medicine. And one of the practices there that they did was letting bloodletting. So Moses would have been familiar with what happened when you went to the doctor, right? But what do we see? God, through the inspiration of God, Moses writing here that life is in the blood. We don't remove that blood in order to heal someone. They need to have it. And oftentimes we understand that when someone loses a lot of blood, rather than just nope, back off and let them heal, right? No. Modern medicine, they give them blood. They're able to do that. And the way that modern medicine is today, they can take that, they can break it down to platelets and other different parts and send it all over the world if necessary in order to save lives. But what do we see here? Is this something that Moses really obviously would not have been thinking about from his experience on the earth? Again, with his background being from Egypt, but rather it's something that was given to them by God. The next thing we'll find in Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11, and there's, trust me, a whole lot of these that we could look at, but we're going to try to keep it here fairly close to the book of Leviticus, and then we'll jump to another in Genesis as we close out. But Leviticus chapter 11, certain animals carry diseases. And we can understand that. Leviticus chapter 11 is that chapter that really where Moses was pointing out what animals that they were allowed to eat, what animals they needed not to eat. And probably the first one that comes to mind that as you think about the Jewish people not being able to eat is that of what? The pig, right? And we see that in verse 7 of chapter 11. As this chapter begins, he points out that those that split the hoof and chew the cud, those you can eat, but if they split the hoof but you don't. The pig fits that category, and we'll see that in verse 7. The swine, though he divide the hoof and be cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud, he's unclean to you. Of their flesh shall ye not eat, and their carcass shall ye not touch. They are unclean to you. We think about the pig, and what do we know about it today? We understand that there are a lot of diseases that can be transmitted if we were to eat that meat but not cook it properly, right? A lot of third world countries that really don't have very good environments of raising different types of animals like we do here in the U.S. Hogs are raised in houses, and they do a very strict job of keeping people away and trying to keep any type of diseases from getting into those environments in order to keep us safe, so we have a safe product when we eat it. But a lot of those countries, a lot of times, if someone gets sick, and you can think of many different television shows, medical shows they'll always have at least one episode where they've got somebody that has been traveling out of, down to South America, and they ate something they shouldn't have, and they finally get that information, and they can figure out what's going on. Usually it has to do with some type of worms that grow in the pig's meat, gets into the human body, infects the brain. There's a lot of bad things if we eat that improperly cooked. So what we see here is God looking out for his people. Don't even eat any of it in order to make sure that you don't run into these problems. There's a lot of microorganisms that get into them that can cause a lot of various diseases. Not just pork. This is just the first of many that we find in chapter 11. We'll just notice a couple more very quickly. Going on down, we'll look specifically at 12 and 13, or 12 in that list of animals that are in the waters. If they have fins and scales, they're good to eat. If they have not fins and scales in the seas, those are the ones you have to stay away from. Verse 12, whatsoever hath no fins nor scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination unto you. One of the things that jumps out from that verse, that even today and down along the Gulf Coast that comes to mind are oysters, raw oysters. That's something that a lot of people, a lot of restaurants will serve. Here we find God pointing out that those are things that his people should stay away from. And we can understand somewhat why today oysters, They have the ability, again, to have a bacteria that can't be detected just by looking at it. Doesn't have a smell, looks just like a very healthy oyster, but when you eat it, it has a bacteria that is so bad, if I remember reading correctly, about 50% of the people that have ingested that don't make it. And if we think about our today, even rules that we have today, our health department has a seafood branch, and part of what they do is they'll pull samples to test and make sure that those are healthy. There are times that they'll close areas from these types of things being harvested because they're trying to protect the end consumer, those that are going to eat them, because they've detected those problems. But again, what do we find? We find God making sure that his people stayed away from that. Not just that, you could continue down verse 19 as he's talking about a list of birds, and again, the bat is mentioned in this list. Some people say, well, see there, they didn't category it. Bat's not a bird, and it's not. It's a mammal, but what does it do? It flies like a bird. It looks like a bird. To those people, God would have included it on that list or in this category. But we see it's also mentioned. All fowls that creep going on all fours are an abomination. The bat is listed there as an animal to stay away from. What do we know about the bat today? The bat's one of the more dangerous animals that we have. It carries a huge number of different types of viruses and bacteria. Most especially, the one we think about the most is what? Rabies, right? Some of the teachings that we had at one time was, if you've even been in the area that these are, you want to be checked. You want to probably go ahead and begin the process of treatment, because if you have rabies, there's really nothing that can be done if you wait too long for that treatment. So if you've had exposure, you need to get it taken care of quickly. And bats are so bad, if you even have any type of direct contact, they recommend that you see your physician and begin that because they are so dangerous. And again, God lists them as an animal to stay away from, not to even touch. And we see the wisdom of God. If we were to look at Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 24, we'll notice as we think back to the book of Deuteronomy, it's that second law giving, the second time as the children of Israel had been wandering for the 40 years, haven't entered into the promised land yet because of their sin. But Moses here is again giving that that law for the second time. I'm not sure what passage I said, but it's Deuteronomy 6:24. That's what I meant to say if I didn't. But there we see that Moses tells them why he's going over this law again. And this law would include all the things that we noticed back in the book of Leviticus, many other things. But one of the things we see pointed out, the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always. You see, God was giving his people these things for their own good. They may not have understood why they couldn't eat this animal or that. Pork's pretty good. It'd be rough for that not to be able to be on our diet. I know if it's not chicken, it's pig at our house most of the time. That's typically what we eat. So it would be tough to understand why that was being restricted. But we see Moses tells them why, not just these more important rules, if you will, but all of these things are things that you have to follow. We don't really have time to look at many more, but there are a lot that are outlined. At Leviticus 13, we see the laws concerning that of leprosy and being separated. Coming off of COVID, we understand that idea of quarantine, right? And we see that being outlined in something that one with leprosy had to do. He had to stay away from those that were healthy, again, for their own good. And again, there are many, many others we could look at. But as we end here, there's one other that I really want to focus on. It really doesn't have to do with health, but another example of scientific foreknowledge, things that these people, knowledge that the writer, Moses here in Genesis chapter 6, had, and really, as we look at the idea here, we see that Moses had to be given these things. Moses being the writer, but he's writing about Noah. If I mix those up from here on, I mean Noah, not Moses. So, but in Genesis chapter 6, we understand Noah was given instructions to build an ark, right? One of the things to notice about the ark, and again, this is probably something we've all heard, all familiar with, but the ark was built to a certain ratio. It was built to be roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 30 feet tall. The ratio there is roughly 50 width, 300 length, 30 height. That ratio has been found to be the exact ratio of the most seaworthy vessels, even today, large cargo ships that are made to carry a lot of weight, to not so much to get there fast, but to get there and survive the heavy seas, the rough seas, to be able to go through and be seaworthy. We find being built to this exact ratio. How does Noah understand to do that? Well, the story tells us God gives him that. Noah wouldn't have known it. I doubt he was a shipbuilder. Never see any indication that he lived on the coast. So Noah was given what to do there by God. And as we think about this idea of Noah having that perfect seagoing ratio, if you will, we have to understand that it was something that God had given him. And as we close tonight, I saved Noah for the last, because as we offer the invitation, oftentimes we can look at passages like 1 Peter chapter 3, and we'll turn there as we close tonight. We see that there are a lot of similarities between Noah and the ark that Noah built and the church that we have today. And just a couple of things that we'll notice very quickly is when Noah built that ark, salvation from the flood was inside the ark, wasn't it? He had to be inside that ark to be saved from the destruction that was taking place around. 1 Peter 3 and verse 20, we see that pointed out. Here is speaking of that time when the ark was being built, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. Where were those 8 souls? They were in the ark, weren't they? The same could be said today for us. Salvation there for Noah and his family was inside the ark. Salvation for us today is found inside the church. It's found inside the body of Christ. In Ephesians, very quickly, chapter 5, verse 23. Ephesians 5:23. Here we read where Paul is writing. He's talking about, often we go to hear this portion of Scripture referring to how husbands and wives, but Paul sums it up by saying he's speaking about Christ and the church, using husbands and wives as an example. But verse 23, husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. If salvation is in Christ, 2 Timothy 2:10, we find that salvation is in Christ there. As we think back at comparing the ark to the church, and salvation is in Christ, we need to figure out how to be in Christ, don't we? Because if we were to look, Genesis chapter 7, 21 through 23, just quickly paraphrasing, everything outside the ark was destroyed. And we find that in those 3 verses. Everything that had the breath of life, that dwelt on land, was no more, except for Noah and his family, who was in the ark. And again, the same parallel can be drawn. Those that are outside the church, just as those outside the ark were lost, will be lost as well. 2 Thessalonians 1:7 and 9 points out that this being the case, I'll just turn there and read it. To you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that, number one, know not God, and number two, obey not the gospel, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. As we think about that, as we consider the ark that, and again, why is Genesis so important to be looked at as truth? And why is it important for us to know and to have confidence that those things really happen? Well, here we have something concerning our salvation being pointed back to the ark, all the way back. That's why it's important for us to understand and to be confident, knowing that what we read there truly is what happened. We have God's account of history. We may not have all the individual little details, but he gives us the big picture of what took place. We may not understand exactly what it was like when those waters rushed from beneath and began to rain from above, but we have a picture that it happened, and the earth points that out as well. Just as we think about the ark and the church, if we're not in the church, we'll suffer the same consequences of being separated from those that we love, as we notice there, being outside of the church. If you've not obeyed the gospel, how do we get into Christ? The Bible is very, very plain. To begin with, we have to believe what the Bible teaches. We have to, faith cometh by hearing, hearing by the word of God, Romans 10:17. We understand that. We have to believe that, what we study, what we read, and then we have to be willing to make a change in our life, to repent of those sins, those things in our life when we realize the Bible points out what sin is, and we see that we fit that picture. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We have to choose, are we going to follow a life of sin, or are we going to follow what the Bible teaches? And we have to make that choice to repent. I tell you, nay, Luke 13:3, except you repent, you shall all likewise perish. And we must put him on in baptism after confession, getting ahead of myself. We must be willing to confess to others we believe Christ is the Son of God, and then put him on in baptism. Galatians 3:26, baptism is what puts us into Christ. Noah had to go through the door to get onto the ark. Baptism is nothing more than a doorway into that of Christ. Jesus says, if you believe not that I am he, you'll die in your sins. He is the way to heaven, the way to God. Baptism is the door into him. If there's anyone here tonight that maybe have already obeyed the gospel but has fallen away in any way, you have the opportunity to come forward and make that right. If there's anyone with any need, we ask you to come forward, we stand and we sing.